All right, so without further ado, my name is Michael. I'm a fifth-year CS PhD student at Stanford. I'm advised by Nigam Shah and Chris Ray. And as Venkat said, my research has been focused on developing and deploying machine learning models into health systems with a particular focus on, okay, there's a lot of great research happening. How do we actually get them deployed into the clinic and into the hands of doctors, nurses, and patients, and actually make an impact on patients' lives? Before kind of diving into talk, I just want to give a brief outline of kind of what you're getting into today. So first, briefly talk about the problem, why you should care about patient recruitment, and what kind of the motivation for a lot of this work is. Then I'll briefly talk about some prior work that people have done to try to solve the problems in patient recruitment, and then finally go into the two papers that I think were on the syllabus about applying LLMs to these problems, and hopefully solving it through the magic of foundation models, and then finally talk about some potential areas for future work that I think could be interesting for folks to think about. So first things first, what am I even talking about when I say clinical trials and patient matching? I'll start with a little bit of brief background. Obviously, hopefully the MDs will be very familiar with this, but just want to make sure everyone's on the same page of what I mean when I talk about clinical trials and how it fits into the drug discovery process. Drug discovery is a very long process, and it begins in what's called the preclinical stage. And this usually lasts between 2 to 3 years, and it's basically a scientist, a biologist, a chemist, someone actually in a lab discovering new chemicals or biologics that can be drug candidates, which is great. Okay, so now let's say we've come up with a great chemical that we think will cure cancer. How do we actually get this to patients? Well, now the hard part starts, and that's the clinical trial process. And this typically evolves in 3 phases. There's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, each enrolling a increasing number of patients. And to enroll patients in these trials, there's very strict eligibility criteria, right? You can't just walk into a clinical trial off the street. They need to make sure you have the disease they care about, you don't have a family history of X, Y, or Z, and that you're not too sick to actually be taking the drug, right? And so this is a very long process, can take up to a decade. And the key thing is that the clinical trial process actually occurs in the hospital, in the clinic. And so, what you see here is a clinical research coordinator or a nurse or a physician will be running the trial at a hospital. And then hopefully after you run the trial, the results are positive, you send that to the FDA, they approve your drug, and now you can market it to patients. That's kind of the end of this process. And again, very, very long process. The most costly part is this middle part, the clinical trial part, which is very operationally intensive. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that about drug discovery. Like, we all think about discovering molecules, doing chemistry, all the sexy AlphaFold stuff. But when you look at the process of taking drugs to market, that is a very small part of what it actually takes. And the most of the cost and the time and the effort is spent in this clinical trial stuff, which is literally just finding people to put the drug in and monitoring. And so just to give you some numbers of how much it costs to actually run these trials end to end, this is just, I think, just for successful trials. So, you need to amortize these hundreds of millions of dollars to bring these different specialty areas to market over the failed trials, which also cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but you don't see benefits from, right? And so taking new drugs to market can potentially cost billions of dollars. And what are the major cost drivers of this? So what's really interesting is if you look at where is the money actually being spent, it's not being spent where you might initially think. And so the thing I want to highlight is this big green half circle right here, which is patient recruitment. So literally just recruiting patients for trials accounts for 32% of the cost of running these trials, right? Literally just, I have a trial, I have the drug, I have the sites ready, I just need to find people to put the drug in. That's where almost a third of the money is going when you run these trials. And so when I say this is a very underappreciated problem, this is something I had no idea about before I started looking into this. But if you talk to anybody in pharma operations, this is the killer bottleneck. And so that's the problem, right? Finding patients for clinical trials is hard and it's costly. And it means that trials are delayed and we don't get drugs to patients faster. And so this is what some might call the primary bottleneck in the drug discovery pipeline today. And so what are the impacts of slow patient recruitment and enrollment? Well, first, clinical trials that don't hit their enrollment target are just stopped. it's too costly to keep trying to enroll patients, and the FDA will never approve your drug if you can't get the statistical power that you need. You can't do that unless you enroll enough patients, right? And so the crazy statistic is that 1 in 3 clinical trials outright fails, not because the drug is unsafe or inefficacious, they literally just can't find people to put the drug in. Secondly, overall, roughly 80% of trials are delayed by at least 1 month due to slow patient enrollment. And so if you think from the perspective of a pharma company, right, every day that your drug is on patent and you're able to sell it after you get FDA approval, it could potentially be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. These delays cost millions and millions of dollars to drug discovery companies. And so there's a very high financial incentive to accelerate trials. And then finally, for patients, roughly 94% of patients who might be eligible for a trial are never informed by their doctor about trials that they might be eligible to enroll in. And so this is especially pernicious in areas like oncology, where the standard of care is often in the form of a clinical trial, since there is no cure for cancer. And so your best bet is in most cases to actually find an experimental drug in a clinical trial setting. And so why should you care as researchers? Well, faster recruitment, faster enrollment means potentially more successful drug trials that finish faster, potentially more diverse trials because you're able to recruit more representative patients. Like the crazy statistic is the vast majority of people in these drug trials that we test drugs on are basically, 65-year-old white men. And so our drug dosages are very well calibrated to this demographic, but there's a lot of other people in the United States, and it's just very hard to recruit them. Obviously, recruitment in general is hard, but it's especially hard for these underrepresented groups. And then finally, like I said before, improving patient access to cutting-edge therapies by improving our ability to enroll. And so hopefully I've convinced you that, recruitment is a challenge, and if we can accelerate the recruitment process, there are potentially large societal benefits. So you may be wondering, why is recruitment so difficult today? The answer is, if you've ever gone to a hospital and observed the process, it will become immediately obvious to you. So how does patient recruitment, clinical trial patient matching work today? We start with the clinical trial. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a brief excerpt from a real-world clinical trial that has a list of eligibility criteria that a patient must meet in order to enroll in the trial. And these eligibility criteria, it's typically like 30 to 40 bullet points of things that could be, simple as the patient cannot be a smoker, to the patient needs the KRAS 12D pancreatic cancer mutation and must show metastasis to the lung in the past 3 months, but must not be on these common, cancer patients, something like that. So wide range of sophistication in terms of, how complex the reasoning process needs to be to actually parse these eligibility criteria. And it's all unstructured text. So this is all completely, there's no structure to these things. These things are just thrown onto clinicaltrials.gov and you have to read them yourself. Okay, on the flip side, you have the patient's health record, the EHR in the hospital. And there is some structured data here, but most of the juicy stuff for patient matching for clinical trials is stored in unstructured text, right? Clinical text. And so you have unstructured text on both sides of this equation, and you have to do this complex multi-hop reasoning of, oh, they had this disease, but they don't have a family history this, and they had this 6 months ago, but not 3 months ago. So it's a very complex problem. And again, like I mentioned, most of this data is unstructured, which makes automation difficult. So how do hospitals solve this today? Well, like many things, they just throw people at the problem. And so they typically hire an army of clinical research coordinators whose job is to basically manually go through every single patient record and every trial that's enrolling and say, hey, does this patient meet the eligibility criteria of this trial, right? And so for a single trial, so we did a bunch of interviews at Stanford, a research coordinator might go through thousands of patient records by hand, right? And this is not an easy process. If you've ever tried to, go work through Epic, it's not the most friendly interface. Clinical text is dense, there's lots of jargon. And so for a single patient, it might take a research coordinator, 40 minutes or an hour to review a single case, right? And so, and when you look at their responsibilities, which is, not just saying, hey, this patient might qualify for this trial, but also calling the patient, following up with them, enrolling them, consenting them, almost all their time is spent on this matching process, right? And so when you look at how it's done today, it's no wonder why recruitment is very slow and inefficient, right? It's just, it's too manual, and we need to accelerate this. And so, that brings me to kind of the inspiration for this talk and a lot of research is, can we speed up this patient recruitment process, accelerate drug discovery, bring drugs to market faster? by automating the matching of eligible patients to trials. And, I'm not the first person to think of this as a problem we're solving. Lots of people have tried to solve this problem before. I'll just super quickly talk about some prior work, pre-LLMs. The first thing that people tried was rule-based systems like Elixir. And basically, you would have a domain expert who knew a lot about, cardiovascular disease, come up with maybe a list of 100 regular expressions of things that they thought would be in clinical notes. And then maybe there was some, very complex multi-stage pipeline where you tried to basically throw a bunch of rules at the text and extract some sort of information from it, right? And so that was kind of the first iteration of how people tried to solve this. Next, people started throwing what I would call like traditional natural language processing techniques at this. So how could we turn this unstructured data into something more structured? And a prominent example of that would be a work called Criteria to Query, where they tried to structure the eligibility criteria into like SQL so that you could query your EHR database. And then more recently, folks have tried the end-to-end deep learning approach. So, throw everything into a black box machine learning model, do some sort of, MLP's intention, and then outcomes, yes, this patient qualifies for this trial or no. Unfortunately, all of these systems, I was going to say, unfortunately, there's kind of limitations with all these systems that make practical deployment an issue. With the rule-based systems, you're manually creating rules, right? So it's very time-consuming to create, and you can't easily reconfigure it for new trials. For the traditional NLP stuff, it just really wasn't accurate. And then for the end-to-end deep learning stuff, again, it still struggles with clinical text, and it's not really interpretable. So it's hard to interface with a research coordinator or do this in sort of a human-in-the-loop deployment. Question.
So all of these clinical trials have to go on to clinicaltrials.gov, right? And then there's like a form they have to fill out. So why not just have them enter the criteria in a structured way? Like we know that EHRs have to be like free text helps with like doctors entering their clinical notes, but what about a clinical trial criteria?
I think that would be a great thing that people should do. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons for this. I'd say first, not every company actually reports on clinicaltrials.gov. There have been big litigation cases against specific pharma companies where now they report everything, but they've historically been bad about reporting. Secondly, the stuff on clinicaltrials.gov is not the full criteria. So if you look at an actual trial protocol, it's typically much more complex. And it's very hard to structure some of this complexity in terms of a structured language. And then third, there's just inertia. Yeah. But I think that would be a great suggestion. Yeah. Any other questions about kind of the setup or why this remains challenging? Cool. So, okay. So, these prior approaches haven't really worked great. Nothing is actually deployed into health systems. There have been great papers published, but I'm very interested in how do you get this? How do you design these systems so you can actually deploy them in health systems? How do you overcome those limitations? And so in that sense, these prior works haven't quite gotten to where we want them yet. And so taking a step back, the original goal that we had, was to speed up patient recruitment by automatically matching eligible patients to trials. And so the obvious answer in 2024 is to take a page out of the venture capital playbook and literally just throw the word LLM on the slide and hope that this magically solves our problems. And that is basically the proposal of the two papers I'm going to talk about today, which is basically the same problem, but let's use LLMs instead of these old techniques. So there's kind of two, I'd say, kind of main schools of thought or approaches within this LLM-based approach to patient matching. The first one that I'll talk about, which was a work that I had the fortune of leading with a lot of great folks at Stanford, is, hey, let's just take the most powerful general purpose LLM we have and throw it at the problem and see what it does, right? Super straightforward, GPT-4 is great. Let's see if it solves this problem. The second work that I'll talk about is why not fine-tune a special purpose LLM specifically designed to match patients to trials, and then maybe be able to do it either more accurately, cheaply, securely, or quickly than you could with a larger general purpose model that maybe has capabilities that you don't care about. And I'll say, obviously I was a little bit joking on the previous slide about, just throwing the word LLM on the slide, but I feel like this is actually a very well-motivated use case for language models in a way that a lot of applications in healthcare aren't. Just because this is all unstructured text we're dealing with, both sides, unstructured text. There's this complex multi-hop reasoning. There's this world knowledge. There are these facets of this problem that are very difficult for us to capture in the prior approaches, but that LLMs seem to have in spades. And so it does actually seem like a very natural application to this problem space. So before I dive into the papers, any questions about problem setup, motivation? Cool. All right, so I will start with what I think is the more straightforward approach, which was the work that I led with some folks at Stanford, which was zero-shot clinical trial patient matching with LLMs. And to start with, I'll run through kind of the three main research questions that we had with this work. So the first was, can we even do this? Can we do zero-shot matching of patients to trials in an accurate manner? And I'll talk about what I mean by zero-shot in a second. But the key kind of, again, we're doing all this like very biased from the lens of how do we actually get these deployed into health systems. And so the reason that we took this zero-shot approach or asked this question is it's very easy to deploy something that does not require labeled data, right? That's much simpler than having to label a bunch of data and then redeploy it constantly. So that was why the zero-shot approach appealed to us. Secondly, again, hospitals have limited budgets. And so when you're deploying these things, like the cost actually matters. So can we reduce the cost, time, data, token usage of these LLM-based approaches? And then finally, can we scale these approaches to health system scale, right? It's not sufficient just to be able to run this on 10 patients and 50 notes. Can we design our system in a way where it'll scale to patients with thousands of notes and things like that? And so like all good machine learning, start with the data. So I'll briefly talk about the data we use before getting to the actual methods. The data set we use is called the N2C2 cohort selection benchmark from 2018. It's basically a data set of, we only use the test set. So it's a data set of 86 patients, along with about 400 real world clinical notes that were taken from these patients' health records. And then we have 13 inclusion criteria based on a trial for diabetes. And so these are the inclusion criteria here. I'll share the slides later in case you want to read through them, but basically, there's 13 criteria that cover a variety of conditions. And so the general task that we care about is very straightforward. It's I give you clinical notes for a patient on the left-hand side. I give you an inclusion criteria from my set of 13. And then you literally just do a binary classification task of, yes, this patient meets this criteria, or no, this patient doesn't, right? And then, you can aggregate that over the different criteria to understand if they qualify for the trial or not, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, this is the task we're doing. Very simple. So, okay, like I said before, we're going to do this in a zero-shot fashion. And so it's just super quick primer for anyone not familiar with what I mean by that. Basically, it means we're not going to use labeled data in our approach. And again, this is because it simplifies deployment a lot. Clinical data is very expensive to label, especially if you're running thousands of trials at once, like an academic medical center, for example. So I'll define it kind of with an example. So on the left-hand side, we have what's called a few-shot prompt. And basically, the task here is I want you to translate English to French. And so I'll provide it a few shots, a few examples of the task, and then it'll output the example, the answer. In contrast, zero-shot is I just give it the task and I tell it, hey, give me the output. Right. And so this is really relying on the model to have some sort of baked in world knowledge or familiarity with the domain that you're looking at. And also that, your prompt is able to capture like the important facets of the task. And the nice thing about this is, again, we don't like labeling data. And so how far can we get with the zero-shot approach? And so the answer is pretty far. So these are results on this benchmark with the prior state of the art at the top. This is a rule-based model where basically some domain expert looked at all the criteria, looked at the training set of roughly 280 clinical notes, and came up with like a couple hundred regular expressions that, he or she thought would best capture this data set, right? Very manual, very labor-intensive, a lot of domain expertise. And then here are all the LLMs with zero-shot prompting, and GPT-4 is at the bottom. And again, this was in February, so I'm sure it would be even better now. And as you can see, basically, it's able to, get the best performance on all these different metrics, precision, recall, F1, et cetera. The middle models are open source models, and then the bottom models are proprietary OpenAI models. So, the fact that it can basically match or slightly exceed the performance of this prior domain-specific knowledge is great, but, I don't think that's the real takeaway from this slide. The real takeaway is that it can do this without labeled data. Again, like the zero-shot stuff is just mind-blowing that these models can basically do this with an API call, right? So straightforward, super simple. Deployment is significantly simplified versus these other methods. And so if we want to reconfigure it for new trials or new patients, it's very simple. And so what do I mean by that? Here's the task we had before. I want to maybe swap in a new trial. Well, all of it's just text. It's just a prompt. I swap that in. I want to do it on different patients. It's all just text. Bam, very straightforward to generalize. So we established that we can get high accuracy with these models. Can we do them efficiently at a cost that seems reasonable to a health system? So next, we evaluated several different prompting strategies with the goal of maintaining performance while also figuring out like how much would it actually cost us to run on a per patient per trial basis. So the basic takeaway from this slide is, I guess, kind of this column here, which is basically with the different prompting strategies, basically just like how much information you feed at once in the model, you basically get kind of comparable accuracy, but there's an order of magnitude difference in the cost that it actually takes to run these systems. And so I feel like that's something that not a lot of papers think about, which is what is the actual cost of running these systems? And then can we go the extra step of thinking, are there more efficient ways to construct our pipeline where it's actually reasonable for a hospital to deploy the code that we've written instead of, okay, this is going to cost us $12 per trial. There's no way we can run this on 1,000 patients, right? And again, these numbers are getting even smaller by the day. Third, we wanted to figure out, okay, so we did this on this, small set of 400 notes. How would this scale to patients with potentially hundreds or thousands of notes, right? And so, naively, what we were doing to start with is just throwing all the notes into a prompt and telling GPT-4 to kind of figure out what's relevant or not. And so, the obvious kind of solution for this right now is to do some sort of two-stage retrieval pipeline, right? And so basically we do kind of the straightforward thing where we embed the notes, we embed the criteria, we do some sort of cosine distance, we retrieve the top most relevant notes for the specific criteria that we're evaluating, and then we only feed those top K chunks through the downstream model so that we can cover as many notes as we want and make sure we're only looking at information that's relevant for evaluating a specific criteria at once. And so the results here basically show that you can basically approach kind of top performance or state-of-the-art performance using a fraction of the tokens, the notes that we were using previously. And so here in these graphs, the x-axis is the number of tokens that we use, the y-axis is performance, the green line is the prior state-of-the-art, the blue is GPT 3.5, and the orange is GPT 4. And then the stars are basically like throwing everything into the model at once and seeing what happens. And so I think kind of the main takeaway here is, as a health system, if you're looking at a chart like this, it's up to you to decide where on this chart do I live, right? It's not really sufficient to just throw in AUROC at a hospital and say, great, this is 0.95, deploy it, right? Because they might have cost considerations that you also need to weigh. And so, one of the things about this work and a lot of the stuff that the Shaw Lab has done at Stanford very well that I've appreciated is, looking at things not just from the lens of accuracy, but, cost, efficiency, time, right? Like the actual things that matter when you're actually deploying these systems. And so as a health system, maybe you want to live on a different part of this curve than another health system. Finally, we wanted to think about how might you incorporate a human in the loop if you were going to actually deploy this, right? So, these systems are great, they're accurate, whatever, but a hospital would never just throw patients through the LLM, match them to trials, and then give them a drug, right? There will always be like a physician, a research coordinator, someone reviewing the outputs of the model, right? And so it's unrealistic to think that this model exists by itself. And so that got us thinking, okay, how do we incorporate a human to interface with this model? And the nice thing about working with LLMs, right, is they're just working with text and humans read text. And so it's extremely natural to basically just ask the model, hey, can you explain why you made this decision and excerpt the part of the note that was relevant for this decision? And so then it's very easy for a research coordinator to basically, either Command F or go through the note and say, yes, this makes sense with what I would think, or, I'm not sure about that. Let me understand the model's reasoning. And this is literally, you just, ask the model to explain your reasoning. And so what we did is we had the model generate these rationales for I think the majority of patients and criteria that it evaluated. And then we had two clinicians review the rationales generated by the model, right? So the model makes a decision and then it outputs a rationale. And what we found was that for the decisions the model made that was correct, so the decisions the model made aligned with the gold standard labels in this data set, almost all of the rationales were either fully or partially justified by the underlying node. Right, so very high alignment between the model's rationales or justifications and the clinician's judgment of how they would have made the same decision. More interesting part is even when the model was quote unquote incorrect, which meant that its eligibility decision disagreed with the gold standard label in the underlying data set, the clinicians actually agreed with the model roughly 3/4 of the time. There's a number of reasons for this, like one, just mislabels in the original data set, which was a thing. Two, there's a lot of subjectivity in these eligibility decisions, right? Like, what does it mean for a patient to have a severe cardiovascular event, right? Versus a moderate one, versus a mild one, right? And so the fact that these models can output this sort of textual representation, which kind of get to Venkat's question, like things that can't be captured in structured, queries. There's the great thing about language is it's kind of fuzzy. Like you can kind of explain your thinking and think in ways that you can't fit into like a structured query language. The fact that these models can output language is actually a big positive in this case, because a lot of the reasoning that clinicians go through when they evaluate these eligibility criteria is also quite a fuzzy sort of reasoning. And so it's actually more valuable in some cases to have the fuzzy rationale output by the model for discussion rather than just yes, no, black box, I think this patient qualifies or not. Yes.
Just for these numbers, should we take all these estimated movements or by using
Great question. I think this was, that's a great question. I think this was not the RAG approach. I think this was all the notes before we did the RAG stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, that's that. So I think when you get to these like big models that are trained on tons of data that you're not quite sure what they're trained on, so like is it a question you have to look into, like whether this model maybe memorized this data set already?
Sure.
Or
yeah.
like,
Totally.
How would you check for that?
I mean, I think that's definitely a concern with all research that happens right now. I think I'm a little bit more comfortable with this data set just because you have to go through like approvals. It's not publicly available online. It's a little bit more protected than I guess other data sets. So I feel a little bit more confident about these results, but I mean, yeah, it's a tough question. Yeah, I'm not sure what a good answer to that is.
So earlier you talked about kind of incorporating ideas about the cost and the efficiency when we're thinking about deploying it in the real world. How do you decide or select proxy metrics that kind of best encapsulate all of those applicable other metrics that actually are used in clinical settings? So instead of accuracy, how do I decide, okay, if I'm thinking about it in a deployment setting, what would that proxy metric look like?
Specifically for clinical.
In this setting.
And I guess maybe you give me a sense of like what another metric might be.
Yeah, for example, you guys gave like micro F1 or macro F1 scores, which I've seen a little bit, but I don't know too much about. And I was just wondering, out of curiosity, is that something that was like,
yes,
like how is that? Is there a strong rationale behind choosing those, or are those specifically proxy metrics for what you're talking about, like the cost and the efficiency from a clinical standpoint?
Yeah, great question. Sorry, I should have explained this. So just as a quick background on kind of these metrics. So these are just kind of typical metrics for binary classification tasks. And so I think this is actually a pretty limited setting. This is a pretty decent setting for just, we're just going to go with accuracy. Just because, right, at each decision, you're making a yes-no prediction. And so calculating the precision is very easy. Calculating the recall is very easy. And then F1 is just like a harmonized average of precision and recall. And so you think of F1 as just kind of some sort of averaging between precision and recall here. Yeah. Macro and micro is how you weight it across the different categories. So we have 13 criteria. And so macro will weight all of them equally. Micro will weight each criteria by like the number of examples you have of it. So if there's like 1,000 examples of cardiovascular disease and like 1 of diabetes, basically the micro F1 will ignore the diabetes example. And so these metrics are just kind of standard metrics for binary classification. So I'd say this is a little bit separate from the cost discussion. For the cost stuff though, yeah, that's a good question. Like I think for the proxies we use, it was like dollars, API calls, tokens.
Okay.
But I think like, ideally, right, you'd implement this, you do a prospective study, you measure like time taken to review a single EHR, right? And then like really your primary outcome is, okay, I deployed this system for this trial, I didn't for this other trial. How many patients did I recruit and enroll, right? Like that's the goal metric. How many patients do I actually enroll in the trial? And that's hard without actually running it prospective. But yeah, that would be like the gold standard metric in a deployment setting. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, could you like maybe talk a little bit about the dollars? Because I feel like that's exactly what I was like
Yes.
wondering about. Like, how do you what metrics did you use to
Yeah,
calculate that
yeah,
cost?
so yeah, this was super simple. Basically, we just looked at the number of tokens that were input and output to the model. And then the way that at least OpenAI is priced, pretty much all model providers, is they charge you a per token rate. And so this was the cost of running 8,000 tokens through GPT-4 in February 2024. And so we literally just go to their website and say, okay, this is the price per token, multiplied by number of tokens. Yeah. Yeah, question.
You've talked a lot about cost and efficiency of implementation. Here at UPMC, one of the problems, we have a company that does something similar. And one of the problems is
What's the
that,
company?
Huh?
What's the company?
Realize Intelligence,
Okay.
and they're part of UPMC Enterprises. And the problem they often have is that by the time the data comes out of the Epic EHR system and enters the data warehouse and someone's run the algorithm, that patient, and I work in breast cancer, has already had first-line therapy, which immediately reduces like half the clinical trials they can do. Have you guys tried implementing this at Stanford, or have you faced those implementation challenges? And what do you think is the best steps for that?
That is a really good question. Yeah, I think that's hard. Definitely not covered in this work. I will at the end include a citation of people who actually did do a trial or like a test of this system on a real world trial. And so I would check out that paper. I think it was at Harvard or something. I haven't seen like a really good prospective, like we're implementing this end to end kind of thing. This system is not implemented at Stanford. We're still in discussions with a number of pharma companies to build on this work, but this is still very much within the realm of research. Yeah.
Is Stanford open to it?
Definitely. Yeah, I think so. If you want to chat, happy to chat afterwards.
So you had like the 13 criteria, right? I'm curious which ones were hardest, and like were those any different than the ones that previous systems had struggled?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So yeah, I have to re-reference the paper for the confusion matrix, but I think what we had talked about earlier, like this, I'm just looking at this advanced CAD, which is advanced cardiovascular something, like model really struggles of what does advanced mean. And we found even like clinicians disagreed on that a lot. And so anything that's like the severity of disease, like the models don't have a good judgment of that. And I guess maybe as humans, we also don't, but maybe a more fine tuning on clinical text or something like that would help. But I'd say like those things where it's like the gradation of disease, they tend to struggle with. Yeah.
So maybe that gets to like you need to have a look for human development for those types of criteria.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing we didn't really do, but I think would help us a lot is, to your point, yeah, doing like 3 iterations of like prompt engineering or prompt optimization, whatever people call it, where it's like, oh, okay. I mean, because you can see, right, like, some of these, sorry, I went too far back. Some of these criteria are just like, sorry, I know this is hard to see, but it's like super sparse, like, use of aspirin to prevent MI, or like, alcohol use over weekly rate dependent limits, or like, they're just like super vague and like very short. And so I think for a real trial, at least the protocols I've seen, they're like a little bit more fleshed out. And so I think that would help as well. But I think like constructing something where you do have that sort of optimization loop would definitely help a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask, how do you kind of get over the potential regulatory barriers like HIPAA, where kind of having gotten their consent to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give 2 answers. So one, at Stanford, I assume most academic medical centers, when you become a patient, you consent to having research coordinators look at your data for clinical trials. So that is covered. But secondly, and maybe this is where your question is getting at as well, like throwing it through GPT-4, right? Is that cool? Stanford, and I think many other hospitals now at this point too, have their own secure HIPAA compliant Azure instances of GPT-4. And so that is an option for enterprise healthcare companies that want to keep everything kind of within their own cloud and stay compliant. So that was an issue when we initially started, but I think now it's kind of a solved problem. Yeah, good question.
I see that you are using like vanilla GPT-4 to do this. So to include some medical context, like did you add some medical terminologies in the prompt itself, or like how did you?
No, I forget what the prompt was exactly, but it's in the paper. But no, it was like pretty straightforward. It was like, you're a clinical research coordinator, you're excellent at your job. Here's a clinical note, here's the trial criteria, like match this patient basically. Yeah.
Do you think like having like maybe just a like a dictionary of like the words which could be clinically relevant, but
Totally.
could have double meanings in like general text, which GPT might confuse for. So maybe the advanced thing, the gradation of disease is something that clinically makes more sense than just the regular text.
Totally, yeah, and I've seen some cool work too that's like, how do you retrieve that knowledge, right, at inference time and fill it in the prompt and stuff like that. I think that would help.
Extending off of Venkat question, and while we're discussing rationales, some of these criteria are very specific measurements, like, oh, can this patient walk exactly like this step for however long? And it's not in the note because they're not tested on that criteria until you consider them for the trial.
Yeah.
Because we have these issues of hallucination and sycophancy in large language models. When you were reviewing these, did you notice whether the large language model would basically say, sorry, you need to measure this, or would it try and like piece it together in a way that would be, sort of risky?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, the model I'd say is pretty good at being like, I'm unsure about this. Yeah, I think it's gotten a lot better recently too. Yeah.
Do you think that's the company's system prompts, or do you think that's built into how large language models are trained in the first place?
I just think they've gotten better at training them, and yeah, I just think I don't know. Yeah, they're just I have no idea what they're cooking up, but it's much better. Yeah, I that's a really good point, and I think that particularly has gotten a lot better recently. Yeah. And then I think there's also like, we didn't do this, but like, you could do like an iteration of reflection, or like, have a model critique the output, or be like, find the evidence for this in the prompts, or like you could have like multiple layers of reflection. I think that also helps a lot. We didn't do it in this work, but even just having like, 2 iterations of the model at, looking at the same question can reduce hallucinations a lot. Yeah, any other questions before I hop into the next
I
one?
was wondering how you want the GPT-4 out or implementation. That's cover different.
The what, sorry?
How you want to GPT-4 out or implementation.
How do we pass all the tokens into it? Oh, yeah, we used the 32K context window, which was the largest at the time, and it was able to fit pretty much everything. And then when we did the like retrieval stuff, we were just like, okay, cap it at X number of tokens, and then the rest of the prompt kind of fit in. So we limited the number of tokens, and if there were too many tokens, we would just truncate it. But I mean, now, I don't know, there's like 128 and, 256K models, and so, yeah. Cool. Okay, so I'll just super quickly recap kind of summary of takeaways from this before going into the next paper. So first kind of research question was, can we even do this sort of zero-shot matching? Is it possible? And I mean, at least I think the answer is yes. Like, we're able to achieve state-of-the-art performance on this benchmark doing like very simple, naive stuff. Obviously, this is not real EHR data, but we want to do this on like a public benchmark for reproducibility and comparison purposes. Second question was, can we do this efficiently? And I think the answer here is also yes. And if you're just a little bit smart about what you fit into the prompt at once and how you prompt the model, you can dramatically reduce costs. And so kind of the statistic that I put here is I looked up the cost to screen a single patient for, I think it was a phase 3 cancer trial. It's roughly $35. And if you run these numbers, it's with one of the models prompting strategy we used, it was like, $1.50, right? So much cheaper than manual screening, even in February. I'm sure it's an order of magnitude cheaper now. And in terms of speed, right, it's like hundreds of times faster, right? It's seconds versus an hour per patient. And a clinical research coordinator can then actually go out and enroll patients rather than sitting behind their computer screen doing this sort of drudgery work. And then finally, can we scale these approaches? Obviously we were limited by the size of our data set, but I think it's feasible to scale, this sort of approach. You calculate embeddings over your EHR once, put them into some vector database, and then you do retrieval at test time. And then, again, there seems to be some sort of potential for collaboration with the clinical research coordinator in some sort of human loop fashion via the text the explanations that the model generates. And so the hope here is, okay, yes, we're bringing the research coordinator in again, but now they're looking at, 50 high quality leads rather than scrolling through thousands of EHRs where 90% of them are going to be misses. Awesome. So that was kind of the first approach, which was just, let's take those powerful model and throw it at this problem. Now I will talk about a different approach called Prism, which was, instead of using, the most powerful tool, why don't we create a very purpose-built, fine-tuned LLM for the task of clinical trial patient matching? So this work was published in April, and it was proposed from Triomics and Wisconsin primarily. And this is patient records interpretation for semantic clinical trial trial matching using large language models. And so again, I'll start with kind of their guiding research questions before going into the actual technical details. These are slightly different than the stuff that we looked at. The first question was, can you beat OpenAI, right? Can we outperform OpenAI's magic models with a smaller open source fine-tuned LLM, right? So that's just first research question. Second question, can we do this on real world cancer patients? So again, the data set that we used, it was real world notes, but it's pretty artificial. It was kind of this academic benchmark. They're actually going to look at a real world cancer center and try to actually do matching on actual trials in patients. And then third, can we do this in an end-to-end fashion, right? Can you actually do the full loop without human intervention of matching patients to trials? So those are kind of the guiding research questions of PRISM in contrast to the paper I just discussed. And so the task here, again, same exact task. We're given clinical notes on the left-hand side. We're given an inclusion criteria on the right-hand side. And the model just says, yes or no, this patient meets this criteria or not. And so the metrics will be very similar to the binary classification metrics. In terms of the models we're going to look at, proprietary OpenAI models, so GPT 3.5, GPT-4, which they estimate to be like 1 trillion parameters. We're going to look at a few open source models, which I think are the same ones that we looked at as well. And then they're also going to look at a custom model called OncoLLM, which is a Quen 1.5, 14 billion parameter model that they fine tune on a cancer center's EHR, right? So this is the special purpose fine tune model. And as you can see, it's, an order of magnitude smaller than GPT-4. So this is at a high level kind of what the paper's all about. Basically, I'll walk through each of these components in order, but just at a high level, there's 4 kind of main components they have here. First is trial to questions. Can we convert the eligibility criteria into binary yes or no questions? Second is once we have the eligibility criteria, very similar thing to what I described in the previous paper. Can we do some sort of chunking and retrieval over a vector database of patient notes? Third, we're going to feed the relevant chunks into their OncoLLM and answer questions, the yes, no, patient meets criteria or not. And then finally, there's some scoring module that aggregates these decisions over all the criteria within a trial and then ranks either the most eligible patients for a trial or the best trials for a given patient. And so that's just something to be aware of. There's kind of 2 formulations they're looking at, patient to many trials or trial to many patients. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then just to kind of highlight, where's the LLM magic? So they use GPT 3.5 for this initial step. They use OpenAI's ADA embeddings for this step. And then they use their fine-tuned model, OncoLLM, or any of the open source models they test for this final step. Okay, great. So let's start with the first component, trial to questions. What is happening here? Basically, all we're doing is we're trying to map each criterion in the trial to a set of yes or no questions. And then we're also going to assign each question an importance weighting. Why is this the case? Well, like I said before, trial criteria are very complex. And so a single trial criteria could involve like 4 or 5 different yes or no questions. And so what they're going to do is they're basically going to take GPT 3.5 and they're going to translate this first question, this first criteria, which is, multiple sentences, into a set of discrete yes or no questions. And they do that for all the criteria. Okay, great. Super simple. We're just breaking down questions. Next, they're going to create this graph where there's like logical relationships between the questions, right? So for these first 2 questions, the ones in purple, like they both have to be true in order for this criteria to be met, right? So that's why there's this and. And then if you look at the top here, it says progressive disease of study entry is defined as 1 or more of the following 3 criteria. And so the patient needs to have either this or Q3 or Q4 in order to meet this overall giant criteria, right? So they're basically just decomposing these questions. And then finally, they're going to assign an importance weighting, a tier to each type of question. And I think they just use domain experts to come up with these criteria. And I think they use GPT-4 to classify each criteria under these tiers. Okay, great. So that's the first step. We're just mapping eligibility criteria to yes or no questions. Second step, chunking and retrieval. Okay, we have the criteria. Can we fetch the relevant parts from the patient EHRs for matching? I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This is basically the same thing I described previously. We're just doing classic vector database retrieval. But just to give you a kind of a sense of the size of the data set. So, there's, roughly, I don't know, between 4 to 37 patients in each of these categories. But each patient can have, 50, 70, 200 notes, right? So this retrieval step is important because you can't fit all 300 notes in the context window of this model, and it'll just get confused. Okay, so that's the chunking and retrieval component. Third component is, I guess, the most interesting part, which is the actual question answering. Now that I have the patient's EHR and the criteria, do they have this disease, yes or no? And so this is where we're inserting the special fine-tuned language model. And so again, very similar thing to what we did. Basically, they have the model output an explanation of the question, a rationale of its answer, the actual answer, and then some sort of confidence score. So again, all this is super similar to what we've talked about before. Finally, they have this cool scoring module at the end, where basically they try to aggregate these criterion level decisions into a single score for a patient and trial, right? Because each trial has roughly 30 or 40 criteria. And so the question is like, how do you aggregate all these individual independent decisions into like a single score of this patient is like 57% good for this trial. They try a bunch of different strategies, like they just add them up, like a 1 if they match and a 0 if not. They do this kind of like iterative thing where they rank the criteria by different importances, by the tiers. They also do this like weighted tier thing where, again, they're like weighting the importance of these matches by the tier that you're in. Yeah, I don't think the distinction is super important, but just, different methods of aggregation. And so, yeah, so that's kind of just the general kind of 4 components. Maybe I'll pause there if anyone has any questions about these 4 steps before I go into the results. Okay, cool. So the first thing they test is, can we answer the inclusion criteria, patient, do they match yes or no? Can we answer that question accurately? And so what they do is they take about 10,000 notes from 50 cancer patients. I think there's about 720 total yes or no, or NA questions to kind of get to the previous question of sometimes you just don't know, so you have to output NA. And they're going to evaluate basically how accurate is their model, how many questions can their model accurately answer. And so here are the results. So Prism is their system in red, also called Onco LLM. This middle column is the accuracy. GPT 3.5's accuracy, that's at the top in green, and then GPT-4 is at the bottom in blue. And then what's kind of crazy is like, even again, like people, it's hard for people to even do this. Expert doctors are at like 70%. So, when you see a score of like 68%, like it's not really out of 100, like it's actually pretty close to where doctors get. So it's very impressive that these models can get this high. And so what we see here is that, Onco LLM is able to pretty handily beat GPT 3.5 and get close to where GPT-4's performance is. Yeah, question?
Yeah, in the previous work that you showed for with GPT-4 in the zero shot setting, like we were getting like micro F1s of 0.91 approximately.
Yes.
And this like the question level accuracy is at 63%, and for a correct pair to match, all the questions would have to be like correctly answered. So overall the like
sorry, so this is individual questions. This is not at the trial level.
Yeah. So let's say there are 20 questions formed for a trial and we're using the simple scoring. So if we aggregate all of this, like all 20 questions would have to be correctly answered for a...
Good question. Yeah, sorry. So I'll explain this in a bit, but when they do the aggregate scoring, you can think of it as just like a probability score, and then they rank the trials by that score.
Okay.
So yeah, even if a trial is ranked like 0.001, if that's the highest score, then it'll be the first.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. And then I guess maybe just a general comment, like, yeah, I think these criteria are much more difficult than the ones in the benchmark that we were testing, and that's why you see much lower scores, right? So kind of just to reiterate the last point, right, we're approaching GPT-4. The insight here, though, is that we're doing it with like roughly 100 times fewer parameters, right? So in this plot on the right, which I thought was very nicely done, you have GPT-4, back up a step, the x-axis. I'm actually not 100% sure what the x-axis is here, but the y-axis is accuracy. I'm not sure why this does not match with those numbers, but I think the main takeaway is the size of the circle is the size of the model. And you're seeing GPT-4, which is huge, is like kind of close to Onco LLM, which is tiny, which is better than GPT 3.5 and all these other open source models, these are the open source models that are not fine-tuned, right? So you can even see like, right, like Quen 14b is the non-fine-tuned version of this. Like fine-tuning is pretty magical. This is like a single cancer center's EHR. It's like really not even that much data, and you're getting, basically a 50% increase in performance out of the box. So I think this is kind of a testament to the power of fine-tuning on like, specific data. And so that begs the question, okay, what if I just hit the GPT-4 fine-tuning API with this? Like, would I get 75%? I don't know. No one's tested it yet, but I think that would be interesting. Yeah.
Do you have to have like expert doctors provide the training data for all of those like 720 eligibility questions? So.
Oh, that's a good question. So I think these questions were just used for evaluation. I can't remember if the fine-tuning was just like next token prediction or if they actually do some sort of optimization. Yeah, I don't know if anyone remembers the paper, but yeah. But yeah, that is a good point. And I actually do think like if you're willing to spend a little bit on getting those high quality labels, like those can make a big impact. Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, access BP or in terms of document. Like when you just first any others.
Potentially, yeah. I can see that.
So the on-call LLM is like way better in performing at low quality data sets compared to models.
I see. I may follow you that class. Yeah, I'd be curious. Yeah, to figure out what this is. Okay, so the next plot, basically kind of the same analysis, but they just break the questions to like types of questions. Again, OncoLLM is in red here. So, it's pretty performant all around. GPT-4 is still the best in blue. And then the rest of the models are kind of in the middle and they're kind of not good. Cool. So, okay. So basically the takeaway from that was, special purpose 14 billion model, get kind of close to the trillion parameter GPT-4, does better than GPT 3.5. Awesome. The next task is, okay, now let's actually do this for real. How do we match patients to trials? And so this gets at your question, where the task here is we're going to be given a single patient and we need to come up with a ranked list of all trials they could qualify for. And again, the key here is not that they will qualify for all trials, just that the ranking makes sense, right? Like, I don't know, your Spotify playlist, right? Like you don't like every song, but you want the top songs to be at the top. So for this data set, they have 98 patient trial positive matches, I believe, which is patients who enrolled in a trial, and then 980 patient trial negatives, which is patients who did not enroll in a trial. And for evaluation, they use precision at 3, which basically just means is the actual trial that the patient enrolled in within the top 3 ranked trials ranked by the model. And this is again taken from an actual cancer center. So any questions about the evaluation metric before I go on? Okay, basically like, do we get a hit in the top 3 predictions from this model? And here are the results. So again, PRISM in red, GPT 3.5 in green, and the different x-axis bars are the different scoring strategies I talked about previously. So, honestly, not a huge difference, but basically the takeaway is that OncoLLM beats GPT 3.5 across the board in this patient trial ranking task. The next thing is, can we do the reverse? So I give you a trial, can you come up with a ranked list of all the patients at your hospital by how eligible they might be for this trial, right? And so for this data set, we have 36 trials, and each trial has between 1 to 3 patients who actually enrolled in the trial, and between 5 to 21 patients who did not enroll in the trial. And so for the evaluation, we'll use something called NDCG, which is basically like a way to measure like how well things are ranked. And again, this is from the same cancer center. Again, same exact kind of plot, x-axis, different scoring strategies. Red is OncoLLM or PRISM, and green is GPT 3.5. And we see that OncoLLM beats GPT 3.5 on this task by a decent amount. So, given a trial, it's able to find patients that are relevant. So I think this gets a lot of questions that people have been asking, which is, why is this like, where does the model fail? Why is this hard? How do humans do on this? Like, where are the ambiguities? Does the model give up sometimes? And so I wanted to add this slide just to underscore a takeaway from this paper, which is that patient matching is really hard even for humans. And so this is the inter-annotator agreement of the doctors who labeled their data set, right? So my understanding is that each column is a doctor, and then each row is also a doctor, right? And then these numbers are basically how often they agree with each other, right? And so these are pretty low numbers. Like some doctors agree with each other less than half the time in terms of a simple like yes, no question, right? Which is kind of crazy. And so this led to the conclusion of the paper that we're actually underestimating model performance, similar to the conclusion that we drew in our paper, which was, oh, 75% of the time, actually, the model's right, even when the label says the model's wrong. And so what they do is they actually manually review, like I think 10 trials, and they found that patients were eligible for the top one ranked trial 90% of the time, even though I believe for these 10 trials, they originally said that the model was wrong, the patient's not eligible, right? So basically, like the gold standard labels for this task are like very weak. And we're systematically underestimating model performance. And then again, they also did like a evaluation of rationales, kind of like what we did, and they found that, basically like, 90% of these explanations for the correct answers were reasonable, like 86% of citations were correct, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, this is a nice proof point for the fact that like, not only are these models very capable, and not only do they output rational explanations of what they're doing, but in some cases they're, more rational than humans. The one last thing I would note, kind of getting to previous questions about cost, tokens, like how do you calculate cost, is that I think one of the main benefits or, contributions of this paper was, we're running this much more cheaply than it would take for a health system to run GPT-4, right? And so if you're able to basically get within 5% of performance of GPT-4, but you're doing it for, 100 times cheaper, why would you ever use GPT-4, right? The thing I would just note, and again, I'm a little biased just because of obviously the approach that we ended up taking, is that like these frontier models are getting way cheaper, way faster than you can fathom. And so the numbers that they calculated were based on April 2024 pricing. But if you reran this today, based on current pricing, it'd actually be about $0.25 per patient, and it would be 2 cents per patient with GPT-4o Mini, right? So I think just kind of one takeaway is like, as you're building these systems, like, especially for deployment considerations, where health systems already struggle to maintain legacy IT infrastructure, like keep in mind technology trends and the fact that you want to be on like the right curve when you're adopting technologies for deployment. And so at least my take is, the winning curve to be on is like the fact that these frontier models are just like basically asymptotically approaching zero every few months in terms of efficiency and inference cost. And so that's just kind of something I would keep in mind along with kind of one of the main takeaways of the paper. Any questions about that? Yeah.
So in this sense, what would the next steps for something like an on-call LLM would be in order to match up with like points or like 2 cents per patient cost?
Yeah, that is a really good question. It was developed by a company, and I'm sure they have their own hosting infrastructure. I'm not sure if they pitched it as like, oh, we'll host this on-prem for you. My 2 thoughts are like, one, if you wanted to approach this, you would have to host it at like a Together AI or, a company that's purpose-built for like fast inference. But then again, you're paying the cost of inference. Or 2, you could self-host it, but then, you're paying for GPUs, like your GPUs will go down, like you need like infrastructure to serve your model, like stuff like that. And you need CapEx to buy the GPUs. And so that's like got its own issues. I think one of the most underrated benefits of, these frontier models, besides the fact that they're very capable, is the hosting infrastructure. Like it's just like so much simpler. Yeah. It just takes a lot of the pain out of, hosting models and running inference and doing it. And then the other thing is like, you have to think like from the perspective of OpenAI, right? Like they're batching your request with potentially many other requests, potentially other requests within the same hospital if you're in like a secure instance, right? Whereas if you're serving this model just for this task, you're going to get maybe a handful of requests every hour, right? And so, you lose a lot of the advantages of doing these things at scale. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know how you would get this number down there, but there's a lot of great fast inference libraries out there. And so I'm sure with enough engineering, you could get the cost down. It's just like, do you want to put the effort into that? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I guess earlier you'd shown a graph that was talking about like the accuracy and the relative size of the different models.
Yes.
And from like a clinical standpoint of actually deploying this, both are definitely obviously important, but is there a certain preference over one? Like, they don't mind kind of compromising on the size if it improves efficiency, or, how do you
Yeah.
understand those sorts
Yeah.
of relationships between these?
Yeah, so just so folks can understand, so I believe we're referencing this slide. So the size of the model, actually, like, I don't think you should care about it at all. The only reason why this was part of the paper, I guess two reasons. One, academically, it's just, can we get close to their performance with less parameters? Like, just an interesting research question. But two, the size of the model typically correlates with the cost per token. Insofar as that's no longer the case, like, as a practitioner, I really wouldn't care about the size of the model. I would care about the size of the model if I had to self-host it, in which case, okay, now hosting a 1 trillion parameter model is kind of a pain in the butt, and something 14 billion parameters is much more doable. But even 14 billion parameters is kind of a pain to host. And so I would say for our purposes, the size of the model doesn't really matter. It's correlated typically with the cost of the model. In this case, however, that doesn't really hold anymore. Yeah. Other questions? Cool. So just to kind of summarize all the bases we covered. The first research question was, can we beat OpenAI, right? Which I think is a very valid research question. And I think the answer is like yes and no. We're able to beat GPT 3.5 pretty handily, which again is a 175 billion parameter model. Onco LLM is only 14 billion parameters. Unfortunately, it still lags GPT-4. And so if I was someone just trying to deploy the best, cheapest model, I would be hard pressed to choose something that's not that, especially given that it's much cheaper now. One of the other advantages, though, again, from an academic perspective, which I think is interesting, is it uses less parameters. So I think this speaks to the power of fine-tuning these models. And then also, like, if you really care about privacy, data security, data not leaving your system, then GPT-4 is not an option for you, even if it's in your HIPAA cloud environment. And in that case, you do want a special purpose LLM that you can self-host and control. And so in that case, this would be a great option. Real world trials, can we do LLMs? Can we apply these LLMs on real world use cases, not just academic benchmarks? But I think the answer to this is yes. It seems like, at least from these results, like the LLM was able to reason over real world EHR data, the retrieval system worked, and it was able to get close to human performance. And then finally, can we basically do this end to end? So like the 4 different stages that I talked about. And again, yeah, I think the answer here is yes. Like basically we're able to go from raw clinical notes, raw trial to, structured criteria, chunked notes, answers to our questions, and then a final ranking of either patients for trials or trial for patients. I would say like at least the small qualitative assessment they did showed that, in certain cases, the system can outperform human annotators on this test. So I'll leave you guys with just a very brief slide of potential future work. I think there's lots of opportunities to push research forward in this domain. Like, I think clinical trial operations are just a general area that not a lot of people think about, which is ironic because when you talk to anyone in pharma, like this is by far their biggest pain point. And just not enough people are thinking about this in an academic world. I think there's a lot of commercial interest and venture capital in the space right now, but hasn't been a lot of great research efforts. And so I would definitely encourage everyone to think about this space or talk to somebody who runs clinical trial operations at a hospital, because they will have a lot to say and they have a lot of problems that I think are fairly low-hanging fruit for the technologies being developed in this classroom and elsewhere. In terms of interesting opportunities, one, I think scaling it to more patients, more trials would be very interesting, right? There's tens of thousands of trials happening now. Within a health system, there could be tens of millions, hundreds of millions of nodes. How do you actually do this at production scale? We haven't really done that yet. 2, real world deployments. So I think, a prospective evaluation on an actively enrolling trial would be super cool. And then to the question earlier about, has this actually been deployed or not? This hasn't been deployed at Stanford, but the closest paper I could find was this one, Unlu et al. 2024, which I recommend reading. I think was in NEJM AI. And then finally, we talk a lot about the health system perspective, right? Which is doctors finding patients, research coordinators finding patients, trials finding patients. But what about patients, right? Sometimes it's best just to leave things to the patient and let the patient advocate for it themselves. And especially with how healthcare works in America, right? It can be frustrating to rely on a physician who has to treat, hundreds of patients every week to not only understand your rare type of cancer, but to also know the 1,000 trials happening at Stanford and know how to match you in their head with all 40 eligibility criteria, right? And so there's also this whole other world that I haven't talked about, which is patient-facing tools for this. So I'm a patient, or I'm a caregiver, or I'm a family member. How do I find trials to help myself and disintermediate doctors? And so there's a number of companies I've seen that are doing interesting work in this space as well. And so with that, I'll just briefly thank my collaborators, my lab. Thank you to Adam, Venkat, the whole teaching team for hosting me. And thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or want to follow up on any of the work, feel free to reach me at this email here. Cool. Thank you. Any questions?
A few minutes. Want to take some questions?
And yeah, it's always good to end early. So.
Fine-tuning projects. So, so like, are the researchers like reparameterizing the model, adding it afterwards, how are they doing?
That is a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I think they do full fine tuning, but I need to check. Yeah. If somebody read it more closely than me, feel free to check it. Yeah. But that's a good question. I think you could get away with adapter or something super lightweight. Yeah.
No option.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you tried using that antidote tool?
Personally, I played around with it a little bit. Yeah.
What do you think?
I thought the interface is very nice. I was looking for like a very specific trial and I wasn't able to find it on it. But maybe they have better coverage of other disease areas. But I found it hard with some of the patient-facing tools to find like very specific trials. Which I guess to your point, like, sometimes you just don't know what criteria you meet until you actually go into the office. So, yeah.
Have you guys looked into like multimodal data sets? So I know you guys have worked with like EHR records, unstructured text data, but what about like images
Yeah.
that could
That is a great question.
indicate something?
That is a really good question. Yeah, I think that's like definitely a great area of research. Yeah. I'd say one thing that makes us a good place to start is typically there'll be like a note describing the image, in the radiology report or something. So hopefully it'll be within the text, but some things are missing, and so I think that's definitely an area. of
So it'd be like
research.
redundant, you're saying, because
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, the stat I've heard is like 80% of the data is in the text, but
Okay.
20% could be a lot for certain diseases, especially certain conditions where maybe imaging is more of a factor. So that could potentially be it. I think the hard part then is you just have to be sure you map those representations to the actual eligibility criteria, which are going to be text, right? So you need some sort of cross-modal thing.
so in a hypothetical setting, you said that you had clinicians, at least from what was outputting, to overlook and oversee the rationale behind decisions.
Yeah.
Of the binary predictions and then of course rationale. In terms of like hallucinations, right, which can be definitely a problem in this area. How would that look, especially since if you're deploying this in real world, I don't know if you can get clinicians to like look over every single
Yeah.
output. So from your experience in that and working with that, how does that work and how do you take that into account?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way we thought about how this would deploy it is similar to kind of what the Prism folks did, which was, I basically give you a ranked list of patients for your trial. And then you would still have to manually go through like, this was the model's decision, here was its rationale, yes or no. But hopefully, you can stop after 20 rather than 1,000. So I think that's where the efficiency gain comes in. But yeah, you should have someone. Was there a question there?
Yeah, from I guess from a clinician's perspective, do you think they would prefer the model to just give an information of yes or no, or probably explain in maybe a few sentences why this is?
Would they prefer that, you're saying, over?
Yeah, over probably explaining in a few sentences why they think this.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that would be a good HCI study. How do you present this information to someone? We haven't quite done that yet. I think we just wanted to show that it would be possible if you wanted to provide that information. Yeah. Future HCI research. Yeah.
I guess just sort of a meta question. So, like you said, the first study you did, published February, the second study published in April, were you guys aware of each other? And is this like popping up right now? And is there consensus on like what the problem, how to like
Yeah.
specify this problem? Or is that also evolving?
That's a really good question. So I did know a few of the authors on that paper. But more informally, I didn't quite know what they were working on at the time. I think, yeah, like there's just been like a lot of interest in this stuff lately. I think both from like a funding angle for startups and then as well as like a research angle. And I think it's just become obvious to folks like LLMs should solve this problem, right? And so, yeah. Originally the stuff that we had done was for class projects last year, and then we just never kind of cleaned it up. And we were like, oh, research. So, yeah, research happens in fits and starts. Yeah, I would definitely recommend doing it actually. So like we did it and then we basically let it sit for a year, didn't touch it. And then we were like, oh, maybe people find this interesting. Like if you think you have something interesting and you're like close, I would just finish it and put it out there and not wait a year when like everyone else is thinking about it too. Yeah, that'd be my life lesson. Yeah.
What does the lab like focus on high level? Is it specifically like clinical trial matching or like patient matching, or is it more diverse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Nigam was the main PI on this, and I'd say his lab's just broadly interested in like foundation models for healthcare, the delivery science of like getting models in the clinic. So Nigam was both professor of medicine and also the chief data scientist at the hospital, and so he's very like operationally interested in things. This was kind of a random one-off thing. We're trying to spin up more collaborations based on the work, but yeah, we do like a lot of different stuff. Like this is like a very specific, I guess, project. Yeah. But yeah, folks are interested in like just general foundation model stuff for EHR data. I'm also giving a talk tomorrow for I think the AI seminar at noon. So welcome to attend that as well. And I'd say that's probably more aligned with actually what the lab is. Yes. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.